Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, it's a new year, so he added another counter to his copy of the Millennium Calendar. It's Matt Morgan.
So it finally snowed, and it was weird. I saw a snowman at the grocery store going through the produce aisle, and I thought it was kind of rude to be doing that because he was looking at the carrots, and you really shouldn't be picking your nose in public.
Okay. Did not once during any of that did I ever know where you might be going with that whole
that's the whole point, is to keep you on your toes, which snowmen have none of because they're just very orbular people.
All right. Up next, he's pretty sure that the Millennium Calendar, that's not a magic card. That sounds like it's something from Yu-Gi-Oh! It's Dana Roach.
I just kept putting off coming up with a New Year's resolution this year. So, to start the year off with a win, I finally settled on deciding to just procrastinate more often.
All right. I mean, I think that's going to work out pretty well for you. That seems pretty good.
Yeah. Like I said, you want to start the year off with a win, and I've managed it.
Yeah. That's a goal that we can all aspire to for this year, Dana. I like that. All right, guys. Well, this week in this episode, we're doing a quick PSA. We want to talk about cards that you should not cut. Folks out there, don't cut these cards or cards like them. And maybe we'll use this also as a springboard to discuss why people cut cards from their commander decks, even when those cards are actually so useful. So a short and sweet one for you here, but we've got some stuff to shout out before we get into our main topic.
This show is being brought to you by Cardsphere.com, our favorite way to turn unplayed Magic cards into play Magic cards. You just add money to your Cardsphere account, either by sending out cards to other people or by depositing it, and people will send you cards that you want at the price that you pick using money in that account. I just got a couple cards in the mail for a new deck I'm building right now, and we'll be sleeving it up here probably soon after this show. Just click on the link in the video description below in the show notes, and check them out at Cardsphere.com, and remember, your deck will have no peer when you build it with Cardsphere.
That's terrific.
The mottos are getting better every single week. I love it, Dana. But also, if you would like to support the show, you can do so in a whole lot of different ways, whether it's liking this video. That's such a huge thing. Just liking, subscribing on YouTube is so huge. And you're already here, so you may as well. But you can also subscribe in your local podcast app. Leave us a review over there. But if you would like to, you can head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where you have all sorts of ways to get yourself a little bonus in exchange for supporting us monetarily. You can get all these episodes a day early. There's a great way that you can just dunk on your friends, give them all the knowledge bombs that we're going to give you here, except you get to do it on Thursdays instead of Fridays. That's a bonus right there. You can do all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including get yourself in the running for the patron shout out of the week. So this week, we're going to give a very special shout out to Sammy Watkins, whose ancestor was Dr. Watkins, worked with Sherlock Holmes. It is so nice to have a real investigator in the building in our fan club here. It's better than anything Karlov Manor was doing, that's for sure.
Whoa, man. Wait, isn't it Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, not Watkin?
Not anymore.
Not anymore? Yeah, you're right.
It's Dr. Watkins.
Yeah.
Joe, I think that you should leave it to the people who didn't get degrees in English and literature to decide what it really was.
Totally makes sense. You are right. Your attempt at rewriting history has worked very successfully. And frankly, our patron is so freaking fantastic for supporting us. So we'll change anything that we need to, 100%.
I mean, see, I still think the point is a Dr. Watkins still would have been better than any of the sleuths in Karlov Manor, even if it's not Dr. Watson.
Yeah, 100% agree. All right, guys, let's get into our show here. So, Do Not Cut These Cards is the name of this episode. We have each picked one card, a card that we have either considered cutting from a deck or that we have cut from a deck, but then we changed our minds. And we were like, no, we actually do kind of regret that. And we're glad that we put those cards back into our deck because it turns out that those cards are very powerful or very useful, and we'd have regretted not having them in a game. And what's also kind of interesting is that the 3 cards that we've each picked kind of embody one of the big 3 strategical reasons why people cut cards in the first place. So hopefully, folks, hearing our experiences with these cards might help you catch yourself before you make the same mistakes that we did or that we nearly did. Don't make the mistake of cutting a card from your deck that might actually be super, super helpful during a game. With all of that preamble out of the way, Dana, start us off. What is the one card that you're going to talk about in this episode that you think people should not cut?
So the card here is Sudden Spoiling. Instant speed, double black, and a colorless mana. It has split second, and creatures target player controls lose all abilities and become 0/2s until the end of turn. I've talked about this card on the show in the past. I'm a huge fan of it, but the reason I've cut it from decks a couple times in the past and don't want to regretting it is when I'm kind of play testing out a deck, particularly a new deck, and I'm at like 104 cards or something, and I'm like looking at the list and I'm doing test hands and Architect or something and just like trying to get a feel for the deck, Sudden Spoiling doesn't, in play testing, do anything because you're not playing a game. You can like deal out some lands and play some creatures and buff those creatures and see your kind of deck's game plan unfolding. Mm-hmm. And even a card that's like a removal spell. Okay, if you are doing test hands and you have a Swords to Plowshares in hand, you still specifically know like, well, that's to address a problem that I'm not seeing it right now, but I know there's going to be some creature in play that I'm going to want to remove at some point. Sudden Spoiling is so nebulous because it does so many different things. It's really tough to visualize during that playtesting phase what it's doing for my deck. And so therefore, I tend to, when I've gotten down to that point in a deck running black and I needed to make a cut, it winds up being really, really attractive as something to remove because I can't specifically say what it's doing to my deck and why it's making it better. And then I take that deck out somewhere and I play a game and realize there's 15 things happening right now, and Sudden Spoiling would fix every single one of them depending on what's going on.
Yeah.
And I wind up then folding it back into the list. But I've lost games, I think, I would wager, because I've not had it in my deck, because I've just like got to that point where I was making cuts and it's the card that came out because I just couldn't, in my imagination, figure out what it was doing in that particular list.
Yeah, Dana, having a place where sometimes you don't really know what role a card is going to take in any given game because it can do so many different things, that's a super common flaw with a lot of utility cards. A card that came out in Duskmoor that I'm really trying to find a home for, but I can't justify it in my brain a lot of times, is Untimely Malfunction. It's kind of the same thing where it's doing a little bit of everything, but it's multifaceted in how it's doing it, because you can either destroy an artifact, change the target of a spell with a single target, or make it so that 2 target creatures can't block this turn. It's hard to predict, especially when you're goldfishing, what mode you're going to be choosing at what given time.
Yeah, Dana, I love what you pointed out here about like these cards not necessarily feeling proactive during the playtesting part when you're tuning up your decks. Mm-hmm. The experience that you have when you're on your own versus the experience of actually being in the thick of it in a game. Mm-hmm. It's hard to visualize, as you were saying. It is hard to like actually transport yourself into that moment. But when you're in that game, you're like, dang, I am very happy that I have this. But it is that nebulousness of those, especially charm cards, I feel like can really fall into this problem. Yep. Of like, it's hard to know exactly what's going to come up. And therefore, in deck building, these cards feel like they might be niche, but they're not niche. They're not niche at all. Mm-hmm. Combat stuff happens a lot. Your opponent's creatures are a problem that you've got to deal with. So don't make the mistake of cutting cards like these, because when you have them in a game, you feel so much safer.
Matt just mentioned charms too. Golgari Charm is one that I kind of have struggled with the same way, because the modes on it, you can, for a black and a green, instant speed, you can give all creatures -1/-1 till end of turn. You can destroy an enchantment, or you can regenerate each creature you control. All of those things feel a little niche, particularly when you're looking at a deck when you're goldfishing. It only destroys an enchantment. Well, that's useful, but like it doesn't destroy an artifact and an enchantment like some things do. Mm-hmm. Creatures get -1/-1, which is useful, but it's not a board wipe. Well, it regenerates each creature I control. Like, that isn't that great sometimes. It's useful, but like it's not as good as Heroic Intervention. Again, when you're like at 103 cards, that is a really easy card to look at and think it's just not quite enough for my deck. But when it's actually in your deck and you're actually playing a game of Magic, all of those modes are useful all of the time, it feels like.
Yeah, it's hard to predict when any given one of those modes is going to be relevant, but when it is relevant, it's super relevant, like just changes the course of the game.
And it's hard to know exactly what your opponents are going to be up to. I have this conflict, Dana, that you're describing with the card Angel of Suffering, which isn't charm or modal or anything like that. It's the 5-mana Black Nightmare Angel, 5/3 flying. If damage would be dealt to you, prevent that damage and mill twice that many cards. I really like this idea, but when I'm playtesting the deck, I don't know how many cards it's going to mill. So compared to the other stuff that I'm trying to do in that deck to fill my graveyard, that one is more of the question mark, which is what leads me to being tempted to like take it out of my deck during that stage. But then when you got it in play and you're like, ooh, can't touch me. I'll put Lightning Greaves on this. Ooh, good luck. You're going to feed my strategy if you attack me. It feels so great, but the playtesting part is where it feels like more of a question mark. So don't make those mistakes. Like lean into those question marks and actually critically evaluate them and think properly of what's going to happen when you're surrounded by 3 other players who are really trying to take you down.
So Sudden Spoiling was like the one card that jumped out at me that I've made this error with. Matt, is there any one particular card for you that like is the kind of catch-all for this is a mistake and I want to not make this mistake again?
Yeah, the one card that I want to make sure I'm never cutting, no matter how boring it feels sometimes, is Village Rites. That's a card that I don't play black very often, but when I do, this is a card that I have to make sure is in there because removal happens in pretty much every single game of Commander. And so making sure that there's just ways to dodge. Like, I know there's a lot of cards like Heroic Intervention. You have protection spells, all that. But sometimes you don't have those. And having ways to just keep the game moving. And we talk about greasing the wheels a lot of times. Village Rites just does that, where you sacrifice a creature along with paying the 1 black mana, and you should draw 2 cards. It's simple, short, and effective. And like I said, removal happens in every single stinking game. So having some way to play 2 outs with that refueling your hand. Dana, you love to say how you've never ended a game with too many cards in your hand.
Right.
Well, the Village Rites just does that.
Yeah, and for this example, you just said they're greasing the wheels. Matt, that's so important here. I don't think Village Rites is a particularly like standout card in the deck, and you actually specialize in playing a couple of cards like this. Scale the Heights is another card that I know you play in a +1/+1 counters deck of yours. And a lot of those cards look pretty minor compared to the stuff that is most exciting to talk about or that creates the most stories in games, which are, you know, the huge, overwhelming Stampede-y type of cards, which you are also quite famous for playing and loving all of those huge, smashy, go-wide stuff. But these cards are the building blocks of that. And if you cut enough of them from your deck's never going to get to the point of being able to do the cool stuff. So I think the lesson of your card here is just like, hey, make sure that you keep the veggies around in the deck.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
It's easy to accidentally cut too many veggies.
Well, yeah, like Village Rites and like you said, Scale the Heights. Those are cards to me that just, I look for opportunities to play them. Dana, you look for opportunities to play Read the Bones, Knight's Whisper, those types of cards that just, they make sure that no matter what you're doing, you have a plan to get to the next phase. And I think that's just so important because like you said, Joey, it's so easy to forget about those cards that do that because you want to play the big splashy mythics that just got previewed in the last set.
A thing I want to touch on with you playing cards like Scale the Heights too, which does a lot of little things. You know, it draws a card, lets you play land, gives you a +1 counter. That card's easy to dismiss too, but that one counter in the deck where you're playing that card, it's actually pretty big. Because like all the Hardened Scales and Corpse Jack Menaces and Branching Evolutions in the world don't do anything if you don't actually have a way to actually apply counters anywhere. And when it comes to +1 counters, we probably all think of like famous cards like Forgotten Ancient and stuff like that to get counters for us. But you can't just rely on a few one-off famous standouts in a deck. You need the density. I've totally been in situations where if I placed even 1 counter on a creature, it would explode into 8 counters on that creature. But without enough counter generators, a deck like that will just stall out instead. So that's an important thing to note about this category of card and why they're collectively so important. Eating your veggies doesn't just mean rampant card draw. It also means the things that ignite your strategy too. Your whole expedition will fall apart if you forget to bring something as simple as a box of matches.
Well, in Village Rites also has a little bit of a problem where, like, at least for me, when I'm building a deck and I'm looking at it, I'm always like, well, this deck isn't really a sacrifice deck. Like, I'm not doing graveyard stuff, so it probably isn't worth it in the stack. That's not at all true. Like, there's almost always a situation, whether it's like, oh, I'm just going to chump block with this creature because this big thing's coming in. That always happens. Your deck doesn't need to be a sacrifice deck for you to have a disposable creature in play that's either going to die to a chump block or, it's a wood elves kind of situation where you've played it and it's got its ETB and you're done with it. Or someone just board wipes or someone goes to steal something or whatever. Like, you don't need to specifically be building things that care about the graveyard or sacrifice effect to have that be a fantastic card. But at least for me, it's easy to get in that mindset that, like, I only want it in that kind of deck.
Yeah, I mean, people play Skull Clamp all the dang time.
Right.
Why would you not want to have something that can do instant speed, get you to draw some cards? And you have backup options too. You have cards like Deadly Dispute, Corrupted Conviction that are kind of doing the same thing as Village Rites. So you probably want more than just a copy of this card in there too.
I think that's the other thing too, though. Like, the other thing that psychologically goes into why we might cut these cards is because there's a density of them. And you're like, oh, well, I already have 4 other versions of this effect. Oh, I already have 3 other versions of this effect.
Yeah.
I can afford to get rid of 1. But maybe you shouldn't, though. Maybe the density of them is what allows the deck to be good in the first place.
Right.
If I cut too many of the cards that help me loot my stuff into the graveyard or that self-mill me for my graveyard stuff, I'm not going to be able to have the big graveyard to pull cool creatures out of that graveyard in the first place. I made a video a while ago that I think was called The Overwhelming Importance of Underwhelming Cards, where, like, don't lose the fodder. The fodder is really important for your deck. If I'm playing Aristocrats, I love having a whole bunch of blood artists that will, like, draw me cards or deal damage whenever stuff is dying. But I need something to sacrifice. I need the density of fodder. And in your case here, the Village Rites example is a good example of the other type of greasing the wheels. It's not the fodder, it's the sack outlet. And you need a good density of those too. You need a good density of the draw that is here. So yeah, these cards aren't hugely appealing, but they're really important.
Well, and Joey, too, for you and any Reanimator player out there, Village Rites is also a protection spell when you think about it, because Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, some of the most played cards in the format, there's so much of the removal is exile based. This at least puts it back in your graveyard and draws you those cards. So when you think about it, granted, you have to hope they don't have a Bajuka Bog or Scavenger Grounds, but this still makes sure that you can reanimate it later on too.
You are not wrong.
And you are welcome, Joey. So why don't you then tell us about your card that we wanted to talk about that you find yourself not wanting to cut in the year of our Lord Heliod 2025.
Yeah, so my pick for this episode is the card Mirage Mirror, which I've come close to cutting from decks a number of times, and I'm always like, no, shouldn't do that, because when I have it in game, dang, does it deliver. And Dana, I understand that you have some experience with Mirage Mirror as well. I'm interested to talk about it with you. Mirage Mirror is a 3-mana artifact that you can pay 2 mana and it will become a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land until end of turn. And it's a very, very popular card, showing up in 770,000 decks out there. 2% of decks that are eligible to play it, and that's big. It's a colorless card, so it can go in. We're counting all of the possible decks out there. That's enormous. This card is really, really cool. The issue that I'm having with it whenever I'm seeing it in my deck lists is kind of a weird thing. It's that it feels generic. The reason I want to cut it is I'm like, well, this could go anywhere. And as a result of that, I don't end up putting it anywhere. And then I regret that. So guys, help me.
That's exactly the situation I had with Mirage Mirror, Joey. Like, it was one of those cards where it was like, oh, it can go in every deck. And it can go in every deck, and therefore maybe not want to put it in any deck. Even when there were situations where it absolutely made sense to be in that deck. I have a Tavash Gloom Summoner deck, and Tavash makes demons equal to the amount of life I paid that I gained that turn. Very regularly, I'm making 15, 20 demons, whatever they are.
Right.
Mirage Mirror, but those aren't creatures with counters on them. They just are that base size. So if you make Mirage Mirror a copy of that 2020 demon, it's now a 2020 creature that can also swing in.
That's so good.
It's a perfect card in that deck, but I didn't have it in there for the longest time because I was just like, by default, ignoring Mirage Mirror everywhere because of that thought process.
So one card that also I think falls into this, it can literally go into any deck, and therefore you never really put it in any deck because it's just fine. Mimic Vat is a card that's always just perpetually card number 103, 104 in my lists.
Yes.
I feel like I have cut it, so I'm making the mistake for you out there in listener land. But absolutely, it's always good, but it's never going to blow anybody away. And because it's so old too, people just kind of forgot about it. It's like, oh yeah, Mimic Vat, I guess. Moving on.
Right.
And that's just not the right attitude.
Yes, Mimic Vat's another perfect. I might switch my example over to Mimic Vat, actually, Matt. I love that. Because, like being able to just quickly nab something that dies, and then you can make token copies of it. And especially the cool stuff that you can pull off with these cards is so wonderful. And you don't even need to depend upon your opponents to be able to do it. Mimic Vat especially is really fascinating if you activate it in the end step before their turn that's about to be yours, and then you can activate it again on your turn and you'll have 2 copies. Like, these cards are up to some phenomenal tricks. And when I actually do have either of those in play, I'm like, yeah, this feels great. I feel safe. I feel protected from like people being able to hit me, because I can always become a copy of a propaganda with that Mirage Mirror, or a copy of the biggest thing in play. They usually survive board wipes. Like, Mirage Mirror can turn into a land, so it'll evade any type of removal a lot of the time. It feels so wonderful to actually have in play. It's just that it doesn't feel specific enough to my usual strategy. And I feel like I always have to find a specific hook for why would that card show up in this specific deck. And it's a little harder to find. And as a result of that, I'm like, well, maybe I don't play it here. And then I do that for every single one of my decks, and I regret it. So don't make my mistake.
Well, you know, another mistake that we're not going to make with our deck building, at least with the YouTube and the episodes here, is cutting challenge of stats. That's something that we definitely cannot cut, though. Dana, what about you? There's
so much great data in EDHREC, and we don't always agree with it. So let's take a look at some data we don't agree with.
Flawless, you guys.
All right, everybody. Well, I'll get us started with our first listener-submitted challenge this year. So Sean Logan sent us an email and said, I have a suggestion for an underplayed card in Gornog the Red Reaper. I opened up a Gornog into the Jumpstart Foundations booster, was looking for ways to make my opponent's creatures into cowards, and stumbled across an old common from Lorwyn called Blades of Velis Vel. So for those of you who don't know what Gornog is, it's the 2 and a red for a legendary Minotaur warrior. It's a 2/3 with haste, and it says cowards can't block warriors, that old line of text. And it also says whatever 1 or more warriors you control attack a player, target creature that player controls becomes a coward, and then attacking warriors you control get +X+0, where X is the number of cowards your opponents control. So Gornog is all about making your opponent's creatures into cowards. There's all sorts of different ways to do that. And Blades of Velis Vel, as we got pointed out by Sean, is absolutely one of those great ways to do that. It's 1 and a red for a Kindred instant shapeshifter, so it has changeling, and it says up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+0 and gain all creature types until end of turn. That's all well and good, giving them +2/+0, because those creatures that you're using and targeting your opponents, they're not going to be blocking anyways, because they're turning into cowards thanks to them getting all creature types until end of turn. This is another example. We've talked about this a lot lately, I feel, where just because a card doesn't have a specific wording, having changeling on there gives it all sorts of creature types that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at specific interactions with creature types, like you have with Gornog the Red Reaper. It's a pump effect. It's a way to make sure 2 people can't block. It's just a great all-around spell. And Sean Logan, I thank you for the challenge. Thank you for the email. It's just such a good, well-rounded way to get around all of this. And yeah, this is a great challenge to start the year off.
Seems like a nice way to make some of the cards that are showing up in Gornog's decks right now, like Enduring Courage and Karlach. Matt, I know you're a big fan of the Enduring cycle, but those aren't warriors, so a card like this can turn them into warriors so that you can then turn more things into cowards. That way you don't just have to fill the deck with warriors, you can fill in some of the gaps there with spells like this, and that's very, very clever. Thank you, Sean, for that for that challenge. All right, guys, I'll move to my challenge now, and it's a new year. And with the turn of a new year, I'm giving myself permission to repeat a super old challenge of stats pick, and that is Stoneseater Hierophant, a 4-mana green creature that taps to untap one of your lands, and it has a landfall trigger to untap itself. I challenged this card as being underplayed in landfall decks back on episode 69. Nice, of this podcast. So I have been banging this drum for more than 5 years, and this card is still showing up in fewer than 7,000 total decks. So, does Lotus Cobra do something similar for just 2 mana, giving you mana whenever your lands enter play? Yeah, absolutely. Does Tireless Provisioner do something similar too, and without the summoning sickness that Hierophant would have? Yes, also yes. But can those cards repeatedly untap your Lotus Field after you play a fetch land? No, they can't. But it doesn't even matter, because you're also playing them too. It's not that this card is better than those other options, it's just that this type of effect in landfall is so good that I genuinely believe you want all 3 of these effects to maximize how often you're able to make it happen. If Lotus Cobra can show up in over 170,000 decks, 17% total of all decks that are eligible to play it, and often showing up in over 60% of decks that have a landfall commander, if all of that can be true of the Cobra, then I think that there's something really strong to be said about how useful this extra mana effect is in landfall decks. My landfall deck, Titania, has not lost a single game in the last 2 years. And in the last game that I played with it, I had a Hierophant in play. I cast Escape Shift to get over a half dozen lands, and I untapped my Lotus Field a bazillion times off all those landfall triggers with the Hierophant, and then I proceeded to just wreck the table. This card is so sincerely good. So here in 2025, I am manifesting that this is the year Stone Cedar Hierophant will finally get its due. That is my challenge. Make the data on this card change, y'all. I promise it's so good.
Well, for my first challenge here of 2025, I'm going to do something kind of shocking, and I'm going to pick a really, really old card that first appeared way back in Alpha.
It's so unlike you.
Yeah, so crazy. The card Death Grip. 2 black to cast it. It's an enchantment, and you can activate an ability on it for double black and counter a green spell. The problem with that, as useful as that ability is how often do you want to just leave 2 black mana available on the off chance your opponent casts a green spell you want to counter? I mean, sure, you want to stop that Avenger's Zendikar or Crater Hoof Behemoth or an Overwhelming Stampede or whatever terrible green things the terrible green player is doing to make their board state terrible. But who wants to leave that kind of mana free? Enter Keurig, Son of Yawgmoth. Keurig has an ability for each black in a cost, you may pay 2 life rather than pay that mana cost. Death Grip isn't a particularly good card when you have to leave 2 black mana free. However, if you can just pay 4 life to stop whatever terrible green spell is about to occur, it's a much better card. And it's currently right now only in 70 of about 14,000 Keurig decks. If you're playing Keurig, particularly if you're playing in a smaller meta where like you know for sure you're going to constantly be seeing problematic green things, you should play that card. But it's probably good enough in a Keurig deck to just play in general anyway. Being able to counter green spells for life in black is amazing, and you should take a look at that card if you're playing Keurig.
Yeah, no beast within for you, opponent. That's kind of gnarly. Although, fun fact, Dana, Keurig is actually one of the commanders that is playing Death Grip the most. In 70 of its 14,000.
By the most, we mean 70 decks, but still.
Yeah, that's kind of wild.
Yeah.
Very underplayed card. Very, you have maintained your status as being the person who finds the most hipster cards on the show. So well done, man. All right, guys. Do we have any final thoughts about cutting cards from our decks, especially with our examples and the psychological reasons that go into why I might take this card out, even though in practice we see those cards doing such great work? Are there any other final notes that you think you want to cap off this episode with about that process?
I mean, I would just pass on the wisdom that our good friend Olivia Gobert Hicks has shouted at me multiple times, quite literally sometimes, is play the dang cards you want to play. And sometimes that means not playing the sexy or flashy cards. It means playing the cards that just get the job done. Yeah. And that's absolutely one thing that I need to keep in mind going into this year is, man, I know that there's going to be a lot of really cool cards that we're going to see, but sometimes you can't forget to get the cards in the deck that are going to make the big splashy cards happen later in the game.
For me, the lesson I'm taking away from this, because I felt like this applied to most of the cards, at least from my point of view, was to not get stuck in a mindset and then fail to reevaluate that. Just because you decide, like we specifically talked about it with Mirage Mirror, I got stuck in the mindset of, well, I don't want to play it because I play it everywhere. And it took me a while to think about the situations where I specifically, like, it actually would shine beyond just being generically good. Same thing, sudden spoiling, you're like looking at my deck list and I'm like, well, it's not doing what I want to be doing, so I don't want it. I got in that mindset and then I didn't reevaluate it until I was in a game situation and I realized how wrong I was. So I think it's just always like be critical of the things that you're assuming to be true. At least give them a once over and verify that they are in fact true, and don't get stuck on thinking the same thing repeatedly.
I really like that, guys. Those are fantastic, good lessons to cap off this idea. Although here's really the ultimate lesson that we really should go away with on these is that you shouldn't cut these cards because you should just cut a land instead.
Right. No, don't do that. Don't do that. I think the 2025 lesson for Dana is don't cut basics. That's what we got to apply. Yeah. It's still true today.
I've still got 8 in my deck. There's room.
Help them out, folks. Help them out. And let us know what you out there have cut from your decks and then regretted once you were actually properly in a game. We definitely want to hear some of your picks. And if you share them with other folks out there, it could probably help them out in their games too. So with that, we're going to call this episode to a close. Fellas, if our listeners want to get in touch with us online, where is it that they can get a hold of us? Matt?
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform, especially Blue Sky lately, at Mathimus55. That's Mathimus 55.
And Dana.
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I've been on Blue Sky a lot myself as well. You can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me everywhere online at Joseph M. Schultz. And you can find the cast online at EDHRECast. Plus, if you have a question for us, perhaps a challenge the stats submission that you'd like to let us know about, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.